Now we move to our third keynote for the day with Professor Niraj Jha from Princeton University, and he will be talking about smart, secure, yet energy-efficient Internet of Things sensors. Professor Jha, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Najwa. So the topic today is a combination of smartness, security, and energy efficiency of IoT sensors. So if you want smartness, you need to put inference on the IoT sensors. I also want security because I don't want people eavesdropping. For example, if I have a medical sensor communicating data to my smartphone, I don't want others to be eavesdropping and figuring out what my health condition is. So I want security. But if I want smartness and security, I need to do more computation. And so that's why there is a yet in the title, because smartness and security go against energy efficiency. So hopefully by the end of this talk, I'll be able to at least convince some of you that all three are simultaneously achievable. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of my ex-PhD students, Ozge Akmandor, who's now at Apple, and Hongshu In, who's now at NVIDIA. So what is IoT? It's a network of physical objects. These are sensors, actuators, microprocessors, and the aim is to gather data, distill intelligence from the data, and optimize some process. So you may have a vehicle that is smart, that is collecting a lot of data and distilling the intelligence from the data. You may have a smart home, you may have smart healthcare, you may have smart energy, smart construction, and so on. So different verticals are becoming smart because of the presence of these IoT sensors that collect a lot of data, transmit the data to the cloud, where some intelligence gathering or distilling happens, and then the decision is conveyed back towards the edge. Well, at least that is the current paradigm. So if you look at applications, and there are lots of verticals and lots of applications, I just have a few here. So if you look at healthcare, for example, there are lots of sensors being consolidated into smart watches and smartphones. You have, for example, galvanic skin response, heart rate, respiration rate, oximeter, blood pressure, and so on. So now it has become possible to collect data locally, and by having some kind of a machine learning model in your smartphone, also do distillation of knowledge from it locally. So that promotes privacy because I don't necessarily have to send the data to the cloud. I can do edge analytics to figure out what the health condition is. And sensors, the IoT sensors are playing a big role in making that happen. You could have smart agriculture. For example, you could send a drone and figure out what parts of the field require more humidity and if the temperature is okay in different parts or not. And you need micro irrigation in certain parts that are suffering. Definitely, you can monitor what is going on in the environment. Is there a fire that is about to break out? There are lots of different things you can monitor about the environment. You may want your city to become smart, smart lights and so on. Vehicles definitely need to be smart. The autonomous vehicles have to figure out if there are obstructions on the path. Lots of images come towards the vehicle and you have to make sense of it in milliseconds. So there's a real-time constraint also in addition to the machine learning that is going on, the inference that is going on. You want a smart grid. Now the homes are also becoming smart. So there are lots of applications, trillions of dollars of impact by the middle of this decade just from IoT. And this is your Cisco model. So you start from the bottom where you have the edge nodes. And these edge nodes communicate with each other, do maybe some signal processing, then feed the data to the cloud, and that takes care of applications at the top and the users. This is the paradigm of the last decade. It is running out of steam because of bandwidth constraints and energy constraints. So there's too much data that I have to transmit to the cloud. These sensors run on coin batteries, so I don't have that much energy available to be able to push all that data to the cloud. So the industry has recognized this, academia has recognized this, and there is a push to pushing the intelligence downwards from the cloud to the edge, like the smartphone, smartwatch, and ultimately to sensors. And we'll see sensors pose a particular challenge in making this vision a reality. So if you look at just our on-body sensors, like just 3-4 years ago, it used to be discrete. You had discrete ECG sensors and blood pressure, skin temperature, and all that. Now you find a lot of these in just a smartwatch or a smartphone. So it's become much more convenient. And the new applications are you could do diagnosis with these sensors. For example, you could figure out diabetic onset or even COVID-19 onset, even with asymptomatic virus situations, or schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression. So a lot of different health conditions are being diagnosed with these wearable medical sensors that communicate their data to the smartphone, where some intelligence resides to make sense of the data that are collected so far. Now you can have implanted sensors as well, hearing aid. You may have if there's a pacemaker that has sensors, there may be an insulin pump that also uses sensors. These may be implanted. And of course, there are a lot of embedded sensors in our environment, and that's what makes our home smart and our environment smart. So as I pointed out, I really don't want frequent battery replacement because, or recharging, because that takes a lot of effort. Some of the sensors are not in well-attended environments. If you've distributed sensors in the forest, it's very difficult to go and change their battery. And these batteries necessarily are very small, and you have to, basically, whatever operations you're doing, you have to do it in nano or microjoules, otherwise you'll run down the battery too quickly. So, and if you do so, then the practicality of the sensors decreases and you will maybe stop using it. Now, currently about 4 zettabytes of data are sent to the cloud. Zeta, as you would know, is 10 to the 21. By the middle of this decade, it will be 180, and by the end, maybe 2030, it'll be around 300 zettabytes of data that you have to send to the cloud. Now, it's not just a question of bandwidth, but if I'm in an autonomous vehicle and that has to send data to the cloud and then receive the intelligence, the decision back, that may take tens of milliseconds. And I may not have tens of milliseconds available to figure out if there is an obstruction, if there is a deer in the path of that autonomous vehicle. So increased latency and also the non-robustness of it. Sometimes the packets will be missing, sometimes the packets may not arrive, and that may lead to catastrophe. So there are other issues other than bandwidth that I also have to worry about. So if you look at Ford GT, it has about 50 sensors and it generates 100 gigabytes of data per hour. So it would be nice if all of this data could be absorbed through machine learning models, and I could make decisions locally instead of sending all of this to the cloud. So there are lots of security vulnerabilities that we are already aware of. There was a denial of service attack, Mirai. There was a breach of security cameras. Smart TVs may leak information in the residential automation systems, smart homes. There are lots of different components that have been hacked already. Industrial automation also through fluid level sensors have also been attacked. So, well, we know how to deal with the security attacks. Well, you can look at timestamps so that if there's a replay attack, you can catch it. You can use cryptographic techniques, encryption, hashing. You can use longer sensor identification numbers. Some of these sensors just have 4 bits for identifying them. So you can just exhaustively go through all the 16 cases. So they enable exhaustive attack. You obviously don't want that to happen. However, if you do all of this, you increase the size of the packet, which means the transmission energy is going to go up. And if you do local processing, it means your computation energy is going to go up. If you add up the energy just for implementing encryption and hashing, the energy consumption goes up by 2.5x on the IoT sensor. So you're draining battery at 2.5 times the rate, which is, again, the reason probably that most of these sensors don't employ cryptography, because it's not practical. However, we saw that there is a push because of bandwidth constraints, latency constraints. There's a push towards pushing intelligence downwards. So we want smartness in our IoT sensor. That's the ultimate of the edge, is the IoT sensor. I want security. If I have an arrhythmia sensor, it's transmitting data without being encrypted to my smartphone. Somebody 20 meters away can eavesdrop on that data and figure out what my health condition is. So I do want the data to be encrypted, but as we saw earlier, that's 2.5 times energy increase. And I want energy efficiency. I want my battery energy in the IoT sensor to last a long time, so that even in unattended environments, I don't really have to take care of battery replacement. So if you look at the traditional sense and transmit approach, the world is analog, so I have to convert that to digital. So I need an analog to digital converter. That doesn't consume much energy. And then after I've done that, what the typical IoT sensor would do is just transmit that data to the base station and the cloud. Base station could just be the smartphone or some other local edge device which has more power. And then you ultimately serve the user side applications. Now, this is energy intensive. And as I mentioned, it's not very secure. And IoT sensors are probably the Achilles heel of IoT systems, because of all these issues is where an attacker probably will attack first, because it's the weakest link in the chain. Okay, so I can maybe place AES and SHA-3 in hardware in the IoT sensor, but that's going to make your energy problem even worse. Okay. All right, so then why not just transmit the data to your base station and then do inference there? That is what is currently being done. But ideally, we want to avoid this also because of the transmission energy that is involved. I'd like to save on that if possible. All right, so then the solution seems to be that let's put intelligence on the sensor node itself. But if I want to put intelligence, that's more computation, more SRAM, more MAC operations to get the features out of the raw data, but I don't have enough energy. And I have other challenges. I cannot transmit too much, and I have the security vulnerabilities. So if you look at the countermeasures to these attacks, you have, well, you can use cryptography, but that increases your computation and transmission number of bytes that you have to transmit. So you have increased energy consumption, which is a challenge. I want to distill intelligence from the raw data. So I want to have inference locally. That increases computations, and that also increases energy consumption. So that's another challenge. So we would ideally want to tackle all of these challenges, smartness, security, and energy efficiency simultaneously. Even on the surface, it appears as if I cannot have all three, because energy efficiency should suffer if I'm doing more computation on the IoT sensor. But let's see how it may be possible to achieve all three. Okay, so I want to do inference locally, and that is what makes it smart. I'm going to use compression for energy efficiency, but the first impression may be that I'm getting energy efficiency out of reducing the computation, but the reason is actually something different. It enables something different that gives you a lot of energy efficiency, and I'll come to that in later slides. And I'm going to give up some of the gains that I make in energy efficiency because I also want security. I also want confidentiality and integrity. So that remains an overhead in terms of energy, but I want to enable that. So we'll look at various applications. There may be alert notification applications. For example, an arrhythmia sensor really needs to figure out if that rare event is occurring. Most of the times, the rare event, the arrhythmia event, is not occurring. So right now, a sense and transmit sensor, arrhythmia sensor, would just sense the ECG data and send it to the smartphone 10,000 times a second. But if I had an arrhythmia sensor, and I'm going to give you an inkling of where the energy efficiency may come from. If I have an arrhythmia sensor, then locally the sensor itself knows that currently I'm not having an arrhythmia attack. So when that rare event is not occurring, there is no need to transmit that information to the smartphone. And you can save a lot on communication. And similarly, seizure detection, the sensors are able to detect the onset of seizure. Seizure is 7 to 10 seconds away, but it can alert you. And so that you can take a seat and you don't just fall down due to the seizure. So these are notifications that have to be made immediately, perhaps to your smartphone. But there may be other applications where it's not an alert that is important. It's continuous notification. I want to figure out what is the human activity. Is the person running? Is he cycling? Just walking, going up the stairs? So there I can maybe accumulate 20 bytes of data and then transmit. Chemical gas classification is another such application. So let me give you the high level IoT sensor architecture, and we'll look at different paths that you can traverse and use this comprehensive architecture in various ways that are subset of this architecture. So you have this analog signal. You converted that into a digital signal with A to D converter. And normally you would just transmit this to the base station, but now I'm going to do some extra stuff. I can compress the data and then do inference. I can extract features, then do classification. If it's an alert application, I can send it to the base station right away, perhaps after doing some encryption and hashing. If it is not an alert application, then I can store maybe 20 bytes of data and the size limit is reached, and then encrypt and hash, and then send to the base station. So I'm doing all this extra stuff, right? So it looks like I'm increasing energy, but bear with me. So this is one approach I can take, and let's call this method one. So doing inference in the compressed domain was an open problem. We had a PhD student, Mohammed Shoaib, he's at Microsoft now. The solution to that problem was in this transactions on VLSI systems paper. So let's call this method one. And here is another approach where you've collected the data, the raw data is in the Nyquist domain, and you do feature extraction in the Nyquist domain and then do the compression and then classification, and rest of it is the same as before. And this we call compressed signal processing. This idea here is compressive sensing, which is a well-known method in signal processing. Here it's a different method, compressed signal processing, which is not to be confused with compressive sensing. And that was introduced by Lucy Liu in her paper in 2016. And all of this, these architectures were put together by Ozge and Hongshu. So we'll call this method two later on. So method one and method two. Compress and then do the feature extraction, and do the feature extraction, then compress. Okay, so let's start with data compression. So I want to decrease the data size because I need to transmit less, and maybe if my data size is smaller, then the computation energy could also go down. However, I don't want to give up on accuracy. If I'm going to do inference with that compressed data, I still want the same classification accuracy that I would have got had I not done the compression. Okay. So the aim is to try to reduce the resources in inference, storage, transmission, and get these energy and storage benefits. So I mentioned there are two methods. Method one is compressive sensing. Method two is compressed signal processing. So let's look at them. Compressive sensing is a very well-known method. You have this n-dimensional vector, that raw data that you derived from the environment. And all you do is basically pre-multiply that vector with an m by n matrix and to get a smaller vector, an m-dimensional vector where m is much smaller than n. Now, the elements of this matrix can be simply derived as +1 or -1. +1, if you toss a coin and its head, it's +1. And if it's tail, it's -1. So it's a random matrix, yet it has magical properties that the distance between the different points in a higher dimensional space is maintained, or basically the classifiability is maintained. So if I have an inference system that wants to distinguish between circles and triangles and my data is in the n-dimensional higher space, after I do this pre-multiplication with the matrix, it goes into a smaller dimensional space, m-dimensional, yet the classifiability, the circles and the deltas keep, they're still separated, so they're still classifiable. That's the magic of compressive sensing. Very simple, just one matrix multiplication, hence very energy efficient. But it was not known how to do inference after doing compressive sensing. So that was the problem that was solved by Mohammad Shoaib. So this random projection, just multiplying by a matrix, is very energy efficient. But this reconstruction is not energy efficient. So that I cannot do on an IoT sensor. So I cannot compress and then reconstruct the signal on the sensor back to the Nyquist domain before I do my inference. So hence the need to do the inference in the compressed domain. So you directly compute on the compressively sensed data instead of reconstructing. And as I mentioned before, there's a famous lemma, Johnson-Lindenstrass lemma, that ensures that the classification performance will not go down much after you do the compression. Now, compressed signal processing, it's still Nyquist domain, and you do this compressed feature extraction. So you do the feature extraction, then there is compression, then the classification. And this also basically involves a matrix multiplication, so also is very energy efficient. And this was the method of compressed signal processing. So we'll use both of these in our applications that I'll show later on. Now, encryption and hashing, I want that. I want confidentiality. I don't want others to find out, for example, what my health condition is from my wearable medical sensors. I want integrity. If I have, let's say, an insulin pump that uses some glucose sensors, I don't want someone to reverse engineer the wireless packet and insert a malicious payload, make sure all the parity checks work out, and send that malicious packet to my insulin pump. And my insulin pump has no way of knowing that this is malicious because all the parity checks, the identification, everything works out correctly. And the wireless packet is telling my insulin pump in too much insulin or too little insulin. So if I'm a diabetic, that would create major problems. So this actually we had shown in 2011 that this attack was possible using an actual insulin pump. So data integrity is also very important. It's not enough to just take care of confidentiality. And you know, the AES algorithm is very well known, very energy efficient implementations are available, hardware implementations that you can put on IoT sensors. Even then, even though they're energy efficient, it still increases energy of the IoT sensor by about 2.5x. So I somehow want to reduce energy much further to be able to accommodate encryption and hashing. SHA-3 is well known. Basically, if there is any tampering with the data, that manipulation will be revealed through a hash check. Now, in terms of the data transmission, it really depends on what communication protocol you use, depends on the application that you have, amount of energy and storage constraints that you have, how much latency tolerance you have, data size, frequency. So Bluetooth Low Energy is often used, in fact, most often used with IoT sensors. It works in a 2.4 gigahertz industrial scientific medical band. It has a master-slave configuration. Master determines the listening schedule, slave listens to the packet. and this saves energy. Zigbee is slightly less popular than BLE, but also widely used, has these 3 different bands, and it's not limited to master slave. It supports various topologies. So if more general topologies is what you want, then you probably would opt for Zigbee. Now, there are other applications like brain-computer interface where energy efficiency is even more important and the data rate is not as important. So there is something that is much more energy efficient than BLE and Zigbee called Medical Implant Communication Service. Works in this band here. And this is really for these implanted medical devices. So depending on the application, you may choose one of these 3 communication protocols. Now, there are many machine learning algorithms or models that you could use, but they are not, for example, if you use support vector machines on an IoT sensor, you would rapidly draw down the battery. So support vector machines don't make that much sense on IoT sensor. But random forest is a decision tree based algorithm. What you do is you have your data set, you have rows that are data instances, you have columns that are features. You take different subsets of rows and subset of columns. So you have a subset of the original data set. You induce a decision tree based on that. So you have one decision tree. You repeat this process, take another subset of rows, another subset of columns. That leads to another decision tree. And you have a couple of these decision trees and you do a vote. So you have an ensemble and you can just do majority voting to figure out what your inference results should be. Now, these decision trees have nodes that are comparison operators, and comparisons or comparators are very energy efficient. You can implement them in femtojoules. So that's what makes random forest very suitable for IoT sensors, because the decision trees are very energy efficient and it's just a bunch of decision trees. Okay, and yet the classification accuracy remains high because of this ensemble that you're using. Your different decision trees are looking at the problem from various angles, and that increases classification accuracy. It also makes it more robust to outliers and noise. It's still very simple. You can use entropy or some metrics like that to induce the decision tree, and the inference is very fast. I can execute the decision tree very quickly. Another method, which is also based on decision tree called AdaBoost, has a slightly different approach, which is I have a data set, I induce a decision tree, and that decision tree maybe is only 70% accurate. So the 30% of the data instances on which it misclassified, in the next iteration, I'm going to give it a higher weight and induce a second decision tree. And again, that decision tree will make some mistakes. So whatever mistakes it makes will get a higher weight in the third iteration, and so on. And until a fixed number of iterations have been executed. So it's still a bunch of decision trees. And these decision trees have different weights associated with them, depending on how good they were in classification. And so it's a weighted sum of votes that you take. And this also gives high classification accuracy. And basically the idea is that I start with weak learners. Each of these decision trees is a weak learner, but together it becomes a robust, a strong learner. And this, because it's a decision tree, it also has low computation energy. So going back to the traditional versus the proposed approach, this traditional approach is analog to digital and then just transmit. And in this proposed approach, I can either do method 1 at the top or method 2 at the bottom, and then do classification, encryption, hashing, and then transmit. So I'm doing all of this extra work. So again, it seems not very evident that I can reduce energy by doing much more. So this seems like a subset of this whole architecture. So if I have a superset, how can I reduce energy consumption? So let's wait a few more slides to try to answer that question. Okay, so I want to deploy the different blocks that you see in this red space in a flexible manner. And you may have different sensors, different applications with different tolerances for energy and latency and bandwidth and so on. So I want to honor all of that and give you different paths through this architecture. So the traditional approach is just sense and transmit, possibly with encryption and hashing. Now that I know about compressive sensing, why not just compress the data and send it through encryption and hashing or directly to the base station? Base station has a lot more energy. So now I can reconstruct the signal there. So won't I reduce the energy quite a bit by doing this compression? Yes, I would. It's about 3 to 4x energy reduction if I do this, because you're transmitting much less. So even though you're doing some extra computation, but you're transmitting so much less that you come out ahead, 3 to 4x ahead, which is non-trivial. 3 to x reduction, 4x reduction in energy is quite non-trivial, but still quite suboptimal, as we'll see. So this is no smartness here. I can make it slightly more complex. I can do sense, compress, and then do feature extraction in the compressed domain, then transmit. And then I can do classification here and distill intelligence here. So there's still no smartness here. But if I do classification here, then I can serve the alert applications as well as the continuous applications. So this is a smart system. If I have encryption and hashing, it is also a secure device, and yet to be shown how it is also energy efficient. Okay, so now I can, instead of doing any compression, I can say, well, I'm in the Nyquist domain here. Let's just extract the features in the Nyquist domain and transmit. Or extract the features and do classification in the Nyquist domain. Let's forget about compression here. And then ultimately, before I transmit, I can compress the data. So this is another approach that could be implemented. This will reduce energy, but not as much as if you had done the inference in the compressed domain. Okay. You can sense, process, compress, then transmit. This is still not smart. I can do compression and then the classification. This is the compressed signal processing idea. No smartness in the first one. So now that I have this extra stuff, I need to account for the energies. I need energy models. Generally, in feature extraction, there are lots of multiply accumulates that you have to do. So there is an EMAC, there's a module that does multiply accumulate. So you have to have an energy model for that particular module. Then you will have to store local data. You may have to multiply some members of the vector with some coefficients. So you have to store those coefficients. So you need extra SRAM that you would not have needed if you had just done sense and transmit. So I have to account for that. Then if you're doing classification, the classifier itself requires a computation unit that requires energy. And then I have encryption and hashing in hardware that requires energy. And finally, the Bluetooth Low Energy or Zigbee or MICS requires transmission energy. So I need to account for that. So you can have a model which sums up all of these energy numbers. You can see that one module is missing, which is the analog to digital converter. And that's because the energy involved in this is much, much smaller than these components. So hence it is ignorable. So let's look at some applications. I mentioned alert and continuous. Under alert, for example, there is arrhythmia detection, which is based on an ECG sensor. I can have a freezing of gait detection for Parkinson's disease. For seizure, it's an EEG sensor that I could use. For continuous notification, I may be just collecting data from the brain. I may just be classifying human activity, classifying different chemical gases in the environment. So let's look at the first one, ECG-based arrhythmia detection. There is a data set available from MIT BIH. The sensor is ECG. The features were extracted using a bandpass filter and a discrete wavelet transform filter. Random forest is the energy efficient classifier used. And in this case, Bluetooth low energy was used for transmission. So this is a bit of a busy slide. So let me just explain. So taking that MIT data set, others have derived inference model. And this is for V-beat and S-beat, the two aspects of arrhythmia detection. And the accuracy is quite high, 97, 98%. Now, so we were still able to get without any compression, 98.7%, which is comparable. But you can see that with method 1, method 2, with different levels of compression, all the way to 20x, still have 98.7% accuracy, even after 20x compression with at least method 2. Okay, so you don't really pay much of a price in accuracy, but you can get a lot of compression. Similarly, on the other side with the S-beat, here you have well, 97.6% is still higher than what you have on the upper side. So with 15x compression with method 2, you still have accuracy that is comparable to what you have without looking at any of these methods. So the method 1 was based on compressive sensing. Method 2, as you may recall, was based on compressed signal processing. So let's look at some results. This is a total energy in millijoules. And this red bar here is if I just use a traditional ECG sensor, sense and transmit, I need 0.514 millijoules. And then if I have a compression unit, but I didn't do any compression with it, then of course I'm going to pay a little bit of a price for that computation. So the energy just goes up a little bit. And if I just compress it and then send mode 2 is the sense, compress, and transmit. And if I do method 1 or method 2, which is mode 3 and mode 4, I get only 3x reduction if I've not taken care of or taken advantage of compression. But we saw that even after 20x compression, you still are not giving up on what you care about, which is classification accuracy. But now you have a 57x reduction in energy compared to the sense and transmit, the traditional sensor. So let's take another application, EEG-based seizure detection. So sensitivity here for both the methods remain 1, even at 24x compression. Here, method 2 gives you much fewer false alarms per hour, so we can choose method 2. But you can see that from no compression to 24x, the false alarms are not really increasing by much. And similarly, the latency is also not being impacted much after even 24x compression. And in this case, compared to sense and transmit, you get 2 orders of magnitude reduction in energy by the mode 3 and mode 4, which are method 1 and method 2. Similarly, for freezing of gait detection, which is also an alert notification application, this is from UCI data set. The sensor is accelerometer, bandpass filter to extract the features, random forest as a classifier, BLE is a transmission protocol. And here, method 2 is better. And without any compression, you get 86.2%. And there's somewhat of a degradation, but not much, even at 10x compression. And here you have even more than 2 orders of, you're going towards 3 orders of magnitude. So the best case application was 900x reduction in energy. And basically you can do things in 10 nanojoules that you needed tens of microjoules before. Okay, and then let me talk about one continuous classification application. This is UCI data set for human activity classification. There are 19 different types of human activity that are classified. Our smartphones now have accelerometers, gyroscopes, magnetometers, and many, many other, about 15 different sensors that you can use to figure out the difference between walking and running or going up the stairs. And In this case, the raw data itself are the features, random forest again, BLE again. And if you look at the energy analysis, so mode one is just sense and transmit. So I really don't need to store anything. So there's no SRAM energy. I'm not doing any inference locally. So there's no classification energy. All I'm doing is A to D conversion, which is not represented here because it's insignificant in terms of energy. And I'm using BLE to transmit, which requires about 6 millijoules. So your total is really that 6 millijoules. Now, if you're doing sense, process, classify, and then transmit, then you have to store some information locally, and that requires this much energy. Classifier, which is in hardware, that requires some energy. But what this enables you to do is transmit much less, about 40x less than what you otherwise would have transmitted. So the key advantage, as you can now see, is really coming from reducing the transmission energy so dramatically that now I can afford the extra computation for inference and for confidentiality and for integrity that I could not afford before. So it's really the reduction in communication energy that is a key enabler for making smart, secure, yet energy efficient IoT sensors possible. So overall reduction is still about 37x. Okay. So in summary, our aim at the onset was to try to not have any trade-offs and achieve all three: smartness, security, and energy efficiency. And I showed that it is possible. It is possible and there are various inducements for making it possible. I have this need to have intelligence as close to the data as possible to address my bandwidth and energy concerns. I need to address the security concerns. Otherwise, IoT systems will be brought down through their IoT sensors. Smart homes are already getting compromised through the IoT sensors. And a lot of industrial automation systems will similarly get hacked through maybe the fluid level sensors, and such. Smart cities will get hacked through their sensors. So security is important. But I really want to run these sensors on coin batteries, and I don't want to replace those batteries too often. So all three are important, and all three are simultaneously achievable. You can have flexible paths through your this IoT sensor architecture, depending on your application, depending on the constraints on your sensor. I showed compressive sensing and compressed signal processing, but it is adaptable to other data compression techniques as well. There, the open problem would be you'll have to show that inference is possible in the compressed domain for the compression technique that you've chosen. And it's applicable to diverse set of sensors and applications. You don't really sacrifice classification accuracy much by doing all of this. And you get 2 orders, and in the best case, 3 orders of magnitude energy reduction compared to the traditional IoT sensors. So I would like to stop here and thank you for your attention, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we started having questions. We have actually 2 questions so far, 3 questions. The first question is from Victor. The question is, both BLE and ZigBee are very low range. So in the slides, when it mentions base station, does it refer to the user's mobile device or some sort of closed gateway?
Yes, you're right that these are low range. And like in a body area network, if I have sensors in the smartwatch, they could be communicating to my smartphone through Bluetooth low energy, and the smartphone could have embedded in it the machine learning model through an app that I can access for my healthcare application. For example, we are doing exactly that for COVID-19 currently, and for mental health. So those are some of the considerations that what is the range of for the communication protocol. If the range is larger, then you're spending even more energy in transmission. So it becomes even more imperative that you try to reduce the amount of communication you're doing. And that increases the effectiveness of this technique.
Thank you, Professor. Another question from Mukul. Thank you, Professor Jha, for this great talk. The question is, are there any similar results experiments for use cases where the data is collected, transmitted by a network of distributed sensors, example nodes and power grids, and the smart decision example classification is based on the aggregation of sensor data instead of local classification?
Great question again. So here you're pointing towards hierarchical inference, and we actually have another paper where let's suppose I have a mix of IoT sensors. Some of them implement our technique and hence are smart, and some of them are traditional IoT sensors. For example, in my body area network itself, maybe the temperature sensor is not going to be smart. It will just transmit my skin temperature data to the smartphone. Maybe my arrhythmia sensor will be smart. So it's really a hybrid of these sensors that form a network that are communicating data. So where do I do the inference? On the smart sensor, I have done some inference. So my arrhythmia sensor knows that currently I'm not having an arrhythmia attack. But on the smartphone, I have collected data from other sensors. So I can have a more advanced inference on my smartphone. But the smartphone has received some raw data and some smart data, a stream of ones and zeros from the arrhythmia sensor. So this is what we call hierarchical inference, where I train another model for the smartphone where it's trained, the data set is a combination of raw data from some sensors and smart data from some other sensors. Basically in the scenario that you're also talking about, I have a bunch of sensors, it forms a network, and the decision is really done on the base station. So that is actually doable through, even in this hybrid situation, through this concept of hierarchical inference.
We have a few more questions. Another question from Taimur is, what is the added cost for sensor smartness in terms of silicon size, microcontroller memory increase, and delays of data sent to the base station? Yes,
so let's look at it in the reverse direction. So if you look at latency, so if it's an alert notification and the extra cost of the computation that I'm doing, instead of just sending the raw data and I'm doing some extra computation, that still would be in the microsecond range. And typically in many applications, I have millisecond or tens of milliseconds latency tolerance available. So delay in general doesn't matter as much. And especially in the continuous notifications, collecting data from the brain, those are small data rate applications where latency matters even less. So delay may not be as much of an issue if you're doing it in microseconds, because typical real-time constraints may be in milliseconds. Definitely, I have extra SRAM that is required, an extra computation that is required. I need a multiplier. I need multiply accumulate units for feature extraction. Classifier requires some extra energy and extra area in the IoT sensor. However, so that is the price you're paying, extra area and extra computation energy, but that doesn't matter because you've saved so much on communication energy. So that definitely needs to be taken into account. If you're using a microcontroller, it makes it more flexible because you can run some software on the microcontroller and you can change that software. But then you're getting into the millijoule range. So your savings start going down for the energy. So it would be better to have ASIC-like implementations. But in some cases, you may still want to use microcontrollers for flexibility. So those are some of the trade-offs.
Another question from Taimur is, for raw data transmission, it is possible to investigate data for incidents later by authorities using data on base station side where decisions are made. What would be an idea on an approach for data access for investigation of faults on sensor-made decisions in the case of smart sensors, obviously in critical applications?
It's a wonderful question. So let's take an example. I have an arrhythmia sensor and there was an arrhythmia event. And you're right that the physician may want to see what happened 10 seconds before I had the arrhythmia attack and 10 seconds after. the physician may want the raw data before and after. So I should have pointed that out, and that is embedded in our IoT sensor architecture. What you could do is you save 10 seconds of data, sliding data at any time. And let's say 10 seconds later, there was a rare event. Then you have a local 10 seconds of data stored in your local SRAM. You transmit that also, that raw data also to the base station. But since you're going to do that in a very a constrained way, in very sporadically, hopefully I'm not having an arrhythmia attack very regularly. So if I'm having the attack once a day, once a week, only then you will have to transmit the raw data 10 seconds before, maybe 10 seconds after, whatever the physician says is the optimal amount of data they would like to look at. So in critical applications, as you point out, the raw data may be important, and you can just store that and transmit that whenever the sensor has detected a rare event.
Thank you, Taimur, for the questions. I hope we answered you. We have a few more questions, Professor. Another question from Victor is, since the device and the gateway are closed, wouldn't physical layer security be a good candidate to increase energy efficiency?
Yeah, so this is orthogonal. You could do, I don't think you can solve the security problem just at one level. It really has to be defense in depth. You have to do something at the base station level, at the cloud level, so at the different network levels. So definitely this is not a solution to all the security problems. It's just that it is a solution to a glaring problem, because IoT sensors are currently so vulnerable that if I want to bring down a smart city or a smart home or a smart body area network, I would just attack these unencrypted data. Like I pointed out in the case of an insulin pump, the student reverse engineered the whole 80-bit packet and could figure out what there was a 36-bit where the payload was, and he could insert his own payload. He could figure out where the parity checks were. He could figure out where the identification for the sensor was. And he reverse engineered the whole thing, and it cannot be deciphered as something malicious by the base station, which happens to be the insulin pump. So this solves that problem. But definitely you're right that I also need to tackle these problems at other levels as well.
Thank you. One more question from Alvaro is, congratulations on the talk. The question is, how can you optimize HTTPS connections from the small device? Do you have any trick when you cannot group messages?
So if it's a continuous notification, then what we do is we group 20 bytes of messages and before we transmit. But if it's an alert notification, then we don't have that flexibility. If somebody is about to fall down due to a seizure that is about to happen in 7 to 10 seconds, then we transmit directly. But at this level, we are not worrying about the HTTPS connections. So it's really it's going beyond the edge. It's really the outer perimeter of the edge, which are where the IoT sensors are. So those are not the considerations at that level. So I hope that answers your question.
Alvaro, I hope this answers your questions. Otherwise, you can still write in the chat window. Alvaro is satisfied. He said, thank you. We still have a few minutes for questions. Maybe, Professor, one question from my side is, how do you see inference playing a role for real-time decision-making related to security? So whether it is intrusion detection, whether it is related to crypto, like, for example, continuous authentication and other security-related decisions on the device?
Yes, so real-time and inference, machine learning are coming together. That's a new field. And what you're pointing out is you also want real-time and secure and ML and inference, which is an even more challenging problem, but a key problem that needs to be addressed. So real-time and machine learning, even without security, you have an immediate need. I have an autonomous vehicle. I want to know if the vehicle is going to hit a deer, and I need to make real-time inference. So I don't have unlimited time. Normally the image CNNs, they are huge and they're run on servers, and they take more than 10 milliseconds that I have available before I hit the deer. So definitely real-time plus ML is a necessity already for many applications. Now, if I want real-time and ML and security, which also may become a necessity as IoT verticals become much more popular, I have not seen much work there, but definitely it's an open area. And this one you can think of as combining real time, because you're also reducing latency in many cases. And inference is coming together and security is coming together. But this is a very small manifestation of all these three coming together. But you're probably indicating that should we proceed towards edge devices and even in servers and get all these three together. And yes, I think the time has come to do that, but I haven't seen much work in combining those three at the edge and the cloud levels.
Thank you, Professor. I think it doesn't seem that we have more questions. I'd like to thank you very much again. Actually, sorry, there is one more question coming from Makul. The question is, what are your thoughts on collaborative inference by the IoT nodes? Is there any hope for achieving robustness in the inference, or the cost of transmitting data between the nodes outweighs the benefits?
Yes, so I can do collaboration in many different ways. The different IoT sensors could be placed on a platform. So I can have a small PCB that supports 4 IoT sensors, and they're themselves smart, but they also do some local smartness before they transmit to the base station. So that is a possibility. That still mostly in the future, although I think people have begun to think about that. Now, achieving robustness in the inference, if you look at ML techniques, inherently they are not very robust. Inherently, they are brittle. If you look at adversarial ML, it succeeds very often against image-based CNNs. So even though these CNNs and DNNs are going to have trillions of dollars of impact in this decade, inductive learning is still brittle and not very robust. And if you look at the old AI, which went nowhere, if you look at, I took my AI course in 1982. So at that time, there was no Python, it was Prolog and Lisp. Those were the languages that we used. So at that time, the AI was deductive. There was an expert system, Mycin, that distilled intelligence from the surgeons on how to predict meningitis. That took 1 year, and it was competitive with the diagnostic capabilities of physicians, but it was not scalable. So for robustness, and this is something that our team is looking at, we want to combine old AI, deductive, which is accurate but not scalable, and new AI, which is inductive, which is scalable but not very robust. So I think, and then you have to bring in causal inference and other robustness techniques also. So I don't think we can claim robustness, and more sensors will still not give you, it'll give you somewhat more robustness, but will still not be competitive with the deductive AI method. So you really need now to look above inductive learning to come up with techniques that are hybrid that can give you robustness.
Thank you very much, Professor. This was great and a great Q&A session. Thanks, everyone. We give you a virtual round of applause and hopefully see you soon. Thank you.